Hello and welcome to our today's session, SAP Security and Compliance 24. We want to assist you getting your game plan ready for the next year. And no monkey, PwC and TechTrust will try to give you some insights about security and compliance challenges that might come up and also affect you. And we founded No Monkey a few years ago to exactly do what we do today, provide the best possible know-how to master challenges about SAP and security and compliance challenges. Because one of the big issues is that there are a lot of competence carriers who understand SAP somehow, a lot of competence carriers who understand security, a lot of competence carriers who understand compliance. But the key when it comes to SAP is to have the context of it. And today I'm very happy to have support with me with Franck from TechTrust, founder and CEO of TechTrust. Hi, Barry.
Hello, everyone.
And Antoine Wuthrich from PwC in Switzerland. Hi, Antoine.
Hi, everyone.
Excited to have that round. And yes, so we will share that hour a little bit and want to give you some insights about maybe what to think of in terms of various aspects when dealing with SAP. We would like to also give you the opportunity to raise questions, to use interaction also via the LinkedIn live stream. Raise your questions. We will do our best to answer them all. If we can't answer them during the event, we will answer them afterwards. Happy to do so. But let's kick it off and have a look into SAP and why specifically SAP is such a big challenge for organizations using SAP, but not only SAP customers, there are also partners who kind of struggle in the ecosystem when it comes to security and compliance challenges. But others on the other side excuse it and say also, SAP is just an app. It's just another app. So is it really just another app or is it maybe something else? And let's have a little bit of a look when we compare the amount of lines of code that sits, for example, in other applications. I'm sure you know the logos, so I don't need to comment. But what you see is that various applications also have different amounts of code being there. And when we talk about complexity, now you can guess what is the last one. It's not SAP, because SAP is actually a completely different ball game when it comes to the complexity of the million lines of code that it contains. And this is the standard coding. We are not talking about custom coding that comes on top, but we have seen customers with multi-million lines of custom code, which are, by the way, made by people. We'll come back to that aspect later, because this is one of the aspects that you have to consider when you do look at your risk. So what has happened in the past? SAP hasn't really been in the press a lot when it comes to cyber incidents, but that doesn't mean that they don't happen. When you are dealing in that area in a regular term, you see a lot of things happening. You also get contacted asking and get asked for help when it's already too late and the bleeding needs to be stopped. But here is a little bit of an overview of some prominent attacks, which you can also research in the internet. So this is not disclosed information. What happened, there are a few big brands. You see Porsche there. You also see SAP itself there with something that happened in New Zealand and Australia, which actually was also people issues that
Regulatory changes, what's happening. Well, let me first take a step back, and it's quite important to think about where we came from. So I told you in 1993, no one was caring about security, but maybe 10 years ago, it was a little bit different. About 10 years ago, there was a strong focus on SAP application security. And I'm talking about my own experience here, having been at Big Four and speaking to many clients, mainly as the auditor. And there I was able to see that there was a change in the way that things have been perceived and how things worked. So you went from this idea of having a dedicated SAP security and basis team where all the security was taken care of in-house. And then we saw there was a move to third-party identity and access management systems. So there we were focusing on the IDM solutions, and IDM solutions are good, don't get me wrong. But what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that the attitude changed and people were thinking, okay, there is an IDM solution. I don't need to worry about SAP security anymore. You have the locked gate, so nothing can get over the garden fence. And here we can see that there were problems. And we also saw the move to the cloud, and there was this perception that everything in the cloud is good and safe. That we'll talk about a little bit later again. And then we saw that there was outsourcing, lots of outsourcing. First of all, to the cloud providers, and secondly, SOC outsourcing. And the thought there was security is now with the SOC. They'll take care of everything. I don't have to worry about it anymore. And then we also saw that within the organization, there was a move of the security team, the SAP security team, to the cybersecurity team. And the SAP security became just part of the whole landscape of security. And it was treated like any other in-scope application. And I'm going to demonstrate to you the importance of systemic risk, because we can see that by outsourcing something, by moving it somewhere else, by moving it into the cloud, you're not actually getting rid of the risk. You need to start to think about risk in a different way. And part of that is actually to start thinking about something called systemic risk. Now, let's look at someone who is famous for all the wrong reasons. You probably would never have known Tim Brown, and he would have been happy to have retired without the whole world knowing about him, but his face is appearing everywhere at the moment. And he's the CISO for a company which is called SolarWinds. And those of you that don't know SolarWinds, they are a US company, a software company, and they provided network and infrastructure solutions for hundreds of thousands of companies around the world. And they had an attack by a nation state player. Microsoft believes that they identified that nation state player. That's Nobelium. And as a result, they were infiltrated, and the breach actually happened in 2019 in September. And it was only discovered by SolarWinds in December 2020. So it was more than a year that it went without being noticed. And we see here for the first time that the SEC is stepping in, that they're holding the CISO and, in fact, the whole company accountable for what happened. And part of that is because of the systemic risk that was exposed, because some of the users of SolarWinds products actually used SolarWinds or relied on SolarWinds for their own products. And SolarWinds had privileged access because it was collecting data on the performance of systems. So it had probably like a SAP all or a very advanced user access right. And we can see here that through that particular breach or leak or cyber incident, things started happening, and the regulators started thinking, now is the time to change. And we could also see that there was an incident at Uber, and there we had the profiles and data of all of the drivers in a particular geographic region actually being leaked. And that also resulted in a rethinking of how these particular breaches or cyber incidents are dealt with. And because these examples are in the US, that led to the attention of the Securities and Exchange Commission. So if we look at new regulations in the world, so I've listed a few here, and I've listed frameworks and regulations together, and that's deliberate. And the question I want to ask is, which ones relate to your SAP system? And the answer is probably all of them and a lot more. And in fact, they say that on average, there are 10 to 15 regulations and frameworks applicable to each company out of a possible 90. And that differs by geography, but it's quite daunting to think that you have to deal with at least 10 to 15 regulations. And anything that involves a third party increases your risk by 13 times. And that's because of systemic risk. Now, are all the requirements the same? If we are complying with the requirements of the US and the EU, wouldn't it be wonderful if they were all covered by a single set of actions and that the requirements were harmonized? That would be a dream. Unfortunately, the reality is that you have to actually comply with each different set of regulations. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And who do I need to report to and by when? And I'll cover that in a moment as well. So that's just setting the scene at the moment. Now, the SEC also foresaw greater responsibility for cybersecurity oversight by the board. And I'm pleased to be a member of the Digital Director Network and a qualified technology expert for boards. So that's a new qualification. You can look them up. And that was created in response to the SEC and the changing regulations around board responsibility. Now we see that the requirement to disclose the processes, the cybersecurity risks that materially affect the business, and we'll talk about materiality in a moment. There needs to be board oversight. Management's role needs to be clearly defined as well. And most importantly is the communication process for any cybersecurity reporting. If there's an incident, things have to be communicated. They have to be communicated very quickly, and we'll get into that in a moment. So that's the quick intro. Now, the SEC didn't go far enough, we believe, as the DDN, in actually mandating that there needs to be someone on the board who understands cybersecurity and technology, like a CISO or a nominated person with similar skills. But at the moment, we're working on that and we're hoping that it will come later. So there is the requirement and the key date. And you will find the requirement under the Christmas tree for Christmas on the 18th of December. You have to comply with that already. And there is a slightly later timeline for smaller companies in the US. The interesting thing is we saw last week, there was a posting about the fact that even non-listed companies may need to comply very soon with this requirement. And although it's actually a US requirement, they may actually be, because of the systemic risk and the requirements for feeder systems and other providers up and down the value chain, you may need to comply with these contractually. So we have a look. I've already covered what the requirements are. And thanks to PwC, we have a nice little neat diagram here that shows you how you can implement all of this. And it's not a simple tick the box. You're actually going to have to go and rethink, relook at all of your cybersecurity and other security policies, procedures, everything from the governance level all the way up to cyber risk. And you need to start thinking about systemic risk because it's probably not covered sufficiently. And we see that many companies are at a particular stage where they still need to do something. As we're near the EU, thought it worthwhile to talk about NIS2. NIS2 is a replacement for NIS, and you can see the requirement is October next year. And this is all about infrastructure security, but it's very important because they've expanded the scope. And what we need to now look at is additional sectors that are in scope. So on the left, you see the NIS1 scope. Those should all be compliant already. On the 18th of October 2024, the original NIS will be repealed and replaced by the NIS2, and that will cover the additional sectors, as well as sanctions across the EU for critical industries. So you will actually see greater harmonization across the EU member states in how this is all implemented and governed, and the reporting as well. Okay. Now we talk about timelines. And here I've given you a scale. These are not all the requirements, by the way. I've just started off on the one side, which is very quick, which is NIS2, 24 hours from the initial notification of a breach or an incident, all the way through to PCI, the credit card information, which actually has no requirement to notify. And we can see here, except the individual who's actually had the breach. Here you can see that the EU within 24 hours, but the next one down, the red one, is the SEC, 4 days of determining a material incident. And it's quite important that we understand the definition of a material incident. And there you see on the right-hand side, this is determined by the registrant themselves. So the company has to decide what is material. And because the purpose of the SEC is to protect shareholders, investors, their viewpoint is the reasonable investor. So they don't care about the technical detail of what went wrong and what caused it and who to blame. They're talking about whether a reasonable investor would be expected to know about the incident in order to make an informed investment decision. And that is the impact that's most interesting. So you also need to report on the nature, scope, and timing, and the impact or likely impact. And once you've determined a material incident, so you've taken it through, so you need to document your decision tree and you have to go through it. And it's not only quantitative, it's qualitative factors as well. So if something caused a death, for instance, and we do have examples of that, then you would need to report that as a material incident. And you'll take it through your decision tree, you'll take it through your policies and procedures, you'll take it up to your board, and then the communication process needs to start and be completed within 4 days. So we saw the casino in Las Vegas, MGM, has just gone through a significant incident, which is material. And if this was already in place, they would have needed to have reported that within 4 days. They have actually notified, and it's been in the press. But from the time that this is actually going to be in force, there'll be new requirements, and they'll need to do that a lot quicker. Okay, so the important thing here is to understand systemic risk, understand from your risk management how you're going to identify that, get your processes in line with the new regulatory requirements, especially incident response and communication, and understand your responsibilities. And you may actually be personally responsible for some of this, depending on where you're actually working and living. Okay, so is Jochen back with us yet?
He's not. I will take over.
Okay, then let me see if I can figure out how to do this. Maybe Marco needs to help me here. Stop sharing. I found it.
Right. Antoine, can you please start sharing? right.
And I
Right,
start.
Antoine,
So,
there you go.
so Barry took you through the complexity of all these regulations, and I would like to maybe take one specific example. Just before this, I would like just to speak about PwC. You probably all know PwC as an audit firm, but actually we do a lot about cybersecurity. Just to give you a full picture, we have 380,000 employees, but we have a few thousands of employees only focusing on SAP Cyber. So this is a big topic. We do the whole thing starting from the organization governance. How can we set up the right level of attention within a company, down to the actually operations, making things happen, the settings and configuration. And actually the outcome is not bad. If you look at the last Foresta picture, it's pretty high. It's pretty high. What I would like to do today is take one example on one piece of regulation. I'll come to this, just see the implication, the cost, the consequences that may have on you. I would like also to explore some strategies you may have in mind to avoid or to take the opportunity of this new regulation, but how this is addressing your decision. And the example I'm taking could be you as part of managing the authorizations, part of you managing the security of the data. I'm taking you to India. I would have taken maybe China, but there are like 20 new regulations coming up. But India is interesting because first, it impacts a lot of companies and probably a lot of you without you knowing it. So the second topic is actually because it's easy to explain, but the impact is pretty big on your strategy when it comes to SAP. And three is you can act on it pretty quickly. So let me give you a bit of the example. As I told you, the requirements are very basic. You're running SAP somewhere, one instance globally, but now what India tells you, and the regulation is already in place starting this year, so you need to have a daily backup that is actually local. So just to be conceptual, daily is not an issue. You can run a backup daily. You could say even you using maybe a hyperscaler or outsource your backupping, but it needs to be in India. So if you think now of the global trend of having one instance and your backup may just not be in India, it would just not work. So just that requirements is redesigning the entire concept of one instance. Where should your data be? Where your data should be for backups? What is the impact on your infrastructure in the end? And the second point is really about the full audit trail, and we'll come to this because it's actually tricky. So the call for action, what they ask every company to do, the Indian government is actually to apply these daily backups and audit trail, but that has a technical implication. Think about one instance, multiple instance, location of your backup, security, replication of system interfaces. Everything needs to be actually at some point based in India. And you have to demonstrate that compliance and the fact that you're actually logging all these trails and backupping every day. The tricky things is you may say, well, maybe I can get an exemptions, but actually it's applicable to every single company that is doing accounting in India. So it could be because you have local legal entity in India, maybe because you outsourced part of your execution and accounting in India. So there's no exception. Every company is there, including based on size. It could be very small, it could be very big, it could be private and public. You're exposed to this. And the other one, the last one, it says, irrespective of your landscape, it could be on-premise, it could be cloud, they don't care. They need a local daily backup with a full audit trail. This is interesting. No one knows about that. When I'm speaking about this to my clients, most of them did not know, and they have to comply with consequences if you don't apply it. The challenge is what to log. Audit trail, you know, SAP, it's on and off, but actually you need to change and log every single change you made on the system. So if you change a purchase order 20 times, you have to get the full trace of the 2020 changes, and on and on and on. You have to back them up. Impact on performance, of course, because at some point we all know that logging certain transactions is very painful. Because when they say you have to log all your accounting transactions, this is all the way up from the sales order, purchase orders, all the way down, making it central to SAP. So we can already see the impact on performance, on infrastructure, but also on protection for the data authorizations. The big challenge is it's valid for SAP, but for every single system you may use, even if you're using Excel at some point. At some point, if you have SAP, Excel, and another 5 systems, you have to comply with this, which is actually bringing even more complexity. And also, it includes direct access to the database. You have to log all the changes at the database level. And again, beyond the technicality of things, you have the retention, the access rights. And when we speak to you today as also SAP access specialist, you have to monitor all the different layers, not just the application layer, but also the database, etc., etc. This is a big deal in India. And as I said before, if I speak about that topic to my clients, most of them do not know. The reason I'm bringing this to you is also because this is not the only regulation. Barry highlighted a few. I'm showing you another few. In Switzerland, we have the new Federal Act for Data Protection. So we need to act and better protect. We have the China Personal Information Act, Compliance Act. Basically, that act prevents you to have any customer related information related to Chinese individuals outside of China. It's the same as for India. It means if you are running a global instance, if you have customer related information on your one instance system, they belong to a Chinese person, they should stay in China and nowhere else. Back to exactly what I was saying before, what is the impact on your infrastructure, on the access rights, etc. ESG, it's big, and you have many standards and framework coming up, and EU Data Act. It's not to be conflicted with GDPR, it's a different question, but starting next year, you have the EU Data Act and many more. I will just close now, maybe with a few questions and statements. Today, if you look at things, most of my clients, no one is really monitoring this regulation and impact on the system. So most of you are today probably going through a migration to S4, or at least upgrades or a change. You have a journey with your ERP, you have a journey with SAP. And the basic question is, what is coming up in terms of new regulation? When will that happen? And what is the impact? Because that will have a cascade of impacts from the infrastructure, the architecture, the access rights, the way you will actually work with the system. So impact is critical and no one is actually looking at it. But there are also a few opportunities, because if you get it right, you can actually anticipate issues and you can differentiate yourself against competitors. This is also an opportunity for you as a person, because most of the time, no one is actually raising the flag for some of these regulation, and actually having someone like you raising, asking the right question is contributing to make you shine as well. So just putting that out, what is your role in that process? Do you need to trigger that right questions about what is coming up in terms of new regulation? This is actually a big topic. Just to give you a bit of a sense, I'm working a lot of S4 rollouts. Sometimes it's between 5, 10 countries, up to 70 countries. We actually had to go through the different regulations to really understand what's coming up. If we have 7 countries to go live, we had to go through the 70 countries to actually understand what is the impact and make the right decision from the start. And it was actually the right thing to do because we're saving cost in the end. So that was my call for action. And I hand over to you, Jochen. Thanks.
I'm sorry for being away for a little bit of a while, but I was actually suffering a little bit from the bad weather I have here. So I lost my internet connection, and I'm sorry when it was interrupted. But I'm sure Barry and Antoine caught it up very well. So once again, sorry for that. Maybe I can complete because it doesn't make much of a difference. The information Barry and Antoine provided are very valuable, and I was talking, just giving examples about some impacts that happened in terms of cybersecurity and SAP. But the key takeaway that I want to give you is that no matter if you look of a security or a compliance perspective on the application of SAP, there are multiple stakeholders that need to work together. This is not only something that an SAP department has to leverage, or an IT security department, or an internal audit department. The art is actually to get the people together. It's, in the end, it will be a people a business, and those departments, they need to work together, because otherwise something happens. What we see quite often is that they're within the island of SAP, which is a certain specific, very important part of an overall IT environment, there will be another island called SAP Security. So nobody really wants to talk Japanese. Nobody really understands the specifics of the application, what it means in context of cybersecurity, what it means in context of these regulatory requirements. And it is only possible when those departments really also meet, know each other, sit on the same table, and discuss what an SAP security and compliance strategy means in terms of their corporate security and compliance strategy. And there we see the three lines of defense, typically with the SAP department, an information security department, and an internal audit department, who report to a C-level. This is like it is the three lines of defense model, which we use and also help to give structure on who is having whose stakes in which area. And in the end, there are three attack vectors that attackers can misuse. And these are not only the technology, these are people, processes, and technology. What we see very often is that companies are throwing technologies on problems that they don't really understand. Considering these three attack vectors that an attacker can misuse, this has limited value because it is super expensive, and it doesn't really make sense when people don't understand why they need a specific technology. But when you start with your people, when they start to learn to understand, then they will also be able to define the right processes that are necessary. And in the third step, you can also check which technology can support my people and my processes, but not the other way around. And this is something that needs to be discussed strategically, which needs to buy in also of a C-level, that these three lines of defense get in place in an effective way. With No Monkey, we also try to really assist you mastering those challenges and try to give you a structure, as I earlier said. And therefore, we made a project for OWASP. We applied for an OWASP project, an open source project, and created this matrix that you can see here. And why is that matrix so helpful? It combines the two worlds of cybersecurity and SAP. So that IPAC model that you see with the areas of integration, platform access, and customization are typical areas that every person who works in the SAP environment understands, and what they can understand what is sitting behind these words, behind these areas, what needs to be done. On the other side, the graphic of the National Institute for Standards and Technology, the cybersecurity framework. This is a language that every IT security person actually knows in those 5 areas. This is how their mindset is built up most of the times. And with that matrix, you will have that structure to identify also the white spot, where does maybe nobody even feel responsible for. And security is always as strong as the weakest part of the chain. When you don't have, from a governance perspective, nobody feeling responsible for a very important area, then you already identified a big problem, which is definitely not technical at that point. So have a look at that, understand the areas and who's responsible for it, and make clear governance. We also, I also want to show you the OWASP project that I mentioned, where that came out. We provide a lot of knowledge as well within that project, open source, where we have some of the best SAP security researchers helping us, working day to day to make the SAP world secure. You will find a lot of helpful advice over there if you want to go deep into SAP security. And I can only encourage you to also help your staff and teammates and colleagues to get an understanding and extend their comfort zone, even though it's in a complex application, but it's worth to understand it, because a lot of business in this world runs on SAP systems, and it's important that these will not be misused by the dark side. So the last advice is really that I wanted to give you is understand your attack surface, considering people, processes, and technology. Don't only look on the technological side, but understand it before others do, because hope is definitely not a strategy. And experts like Barry, Antoine, or the team of No Monkey are happy to help you and support you to master those challenges 2024. We have a few ideas what we would like to do. I'm looking into the questions. Are there any questions that came up in the meanwhile, or is there anything, Barry and Antoine, you would like to end? Because I didn't join the entire time. Anything I missed out so far?
Yeah, I think we do want to follow this up with a live event in Switzerland, and we've planned 2 dates, and we're definitely going to be telling you a lot more about that, and make something where we can take you into a lot more detail. I feel we've just scratched the surface at the moment, and there are many things that can go wrong, and you need to understand a little bit more, and we'll cover that in the events that we plan in Lausanne and Zurich. And yeah, I think that's actually a great slide to end on, because it ties all 3 of our stories together. Yeah.
Yes, it does. So as you mentioned, Lausanne and Zurich are the places where we're going to have the events next year. We will receive invitations for that if you want to participate for this. One will be in March, one will be in June. We will release, as soon as we have the location confirmed, the information when these on-site events will be. There we will have even more time. This was now a quick hour, a quick stormy hour, to give you an idea of the areas that you should consider to look on in 2024. In the meanwhile, you can reach out to us at any point in time, to No Monkey, to TechTrust, to PwC. We can discuss your security roadmap. We can discuss the areas where you would like to improve your compliance. If you have regulatory requirements to fulfill, what does that mean in SAP? We will help you to understand this, attack this surface from a security and compliance view. Antoine, is there anything else you would like to add?
No, I'm looking forward to continue the dialogue. Thanks to all.
Wonderful. So I don't see any questions so far. I see the dark side has cookies, but as far as I can see, there are no questions open. So maybe we can use a little bit of the time, Barry and Antoine, and yeah, maybe explain a little bit or tell a little bit of a story of experiences that you have made when suddenly a customer of yours was totally surprised how open and exposed they have been to attacks in SAP, or even compliance violations. Is there any highlight you would like to maybe share with the community?
It's not always possible to name the client.
No.
I mean, the the one that's also come up recently, in addition to MGM, is Toyota, where they actually had more of a qualitative issue, and we know that most of the companies I'm talking about are SAP users, but we also had incidents which have been reported of deaths, and then when you come to the SEC requirements, that becomes something that needs to be reported and communicated properly. And that's what we need to get used to, is having the right people communicating, having the right connection to the board level. Sometimes CISOs are very, they're not able to communicate to the board level. And we need to make sure that free flow of information can happen. And definitely, because SAP is the main primary transactional system, if there's a data breach and the data is all in an SAP system, that's definitely going to be impacted and need to be reported on. So that's from my side. Antoine, from yours?
I think now Antoine maybe has a connection problem. I'm not sure.
Looks like it. Few gremlins today, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
No.
I think now you're back.
Moving again.
One is a basic one, and the second one is a complex one. SAP and trigger payment. Okay. Well, is a bit more elaborated, but the basic is just to say, every month I have at least 2 or 3 clients coming to me with a fraud issue where people just change the bank details in SAP and trigger the payment. It's basic. And at some point it's a people issue, a process issue, but sometimes also an authorization and security issue from the inside. And honestly, I'm seeing this every second week with client get hacked. Interesting. So basic message, get the basics right. Another one, which is a bit more elaborated, and this is also going through outsourcing some of your tasks and what you do. One of my clients is using a SAP, and they do trade using SAP and some of the outsourcing module they have. So basically they're buying and selling, and they have some AI intelligence. So based on the learning machine, the system is actually buying and selling the goods automatically. So the hacker did not hack SAP. They went just through the learning database that is used. And actually, the machine was learning what is good, what is not good. So they are selling when they make a profit, and they are buying when the price was good. And they changed the learning database to trigger the opposite behavior. And at some point in SAP, the system started to sell when the loss was the highest. So that was interesting because that triggered the fraud, and that was actually monitored in SAP. This is how we captured it. But it's because they were using a module outside of the company, outside of SAP, and the fraud was actually not disrupting the process, but just changing the mechanism for the system to make decisions. And that was an interesting one, how you can trick AI to make the wrong decision and trigger wrong buying or selling decisions in SAP. So food for thought. Maybe the risk is a bit broader and not easier.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. That was very interesting. I can round up the stories as well with a customer I had in Switzerland, where we did a code review. And that was also a finance company, so a regulated company. And within the code review that we did, we suddenly found a hard-coded mail address, which was first name, last name @gmail.com, where we could see that 4 days before quarter end, financial results of that company were downloaded to. So the people in the audience got quite nervous to see that, and they immediately reached out to HR because they saw the name clearly from the email address and asked, who is that? Is that an internal? Is that an external? Who is that? And then HR replied with a little bit of a surprise, because they said that this was an internal who left the company 6.5 years ago. So in other words, there was one person who knew 4 days before quarter end, every quarter, how the financial results of that financial company will be. Huge compliance case at that point. And the people were just absolutely happy that we had a look into that and that they can understand it. And this is so important. That's why we say understand the attack surface, because only when you understand it, you are able to rate if you can accept the risk or if you need to tackle it. And this is something that definitely needs to be tackled, because this is a security and compliance fraud that is happening at that point in time. Something where it just helps to raise transparency and get evidence on the corporate attack surface, to at least identify low-hanging fruit at that point. Okay, we have a question here, which we would like to have answered as well. Are there conflicts between certain regulations foreseeable? I'm looking to Antoine and Barry for this one.
Sorry, can you just repeat the question?
Are there conflicts between certain regulations foreseeable? Because Antoine also explained a lot, and are there maybe conflicts among those regulations that lead to a, I don't know, death end?
Maybe I can
Antoine,
start.
you want to go first? Yeah.
I can start. Yes and no. The regulations have always a different purpose. And because of the purpose is different, maybe the requirements behind are different. So typically, if I take my Indian story, behind the story for the Indian government, it's a tax purpose. They want to make sure they have full visibility of the data in India. And at some point, they want to make sure that if there is an issue, they can deep dive and see the whole audit trail. That's a purpose. But if you speak to the US, they would say the opposite. No, we need the entire data set in the US just to really understand how that works globally. So there's a different conflict between regulation, because the interest of the regulator is slightly different. And at some point we need to make decisions. But usually, and this is a vast majority of the regulation, the difference is mostly in the terms. Barry mentioned in terms of notification timelines, sometimes it's 24 hours, sometimes it's 4 hours. Maybe the data objects that are critical are slightly different. If you look at the Chinese Act, this is more customer-related data. If you look at India, it's more finance or etc. But at some point, it just goes up and up and up, because if you want to comply with all those regulations, you have to take the stricter for all of these elements. So the stricter in terms of timelines for notifications was down to 24 hours. The stricter in terms of data objects meant and flagged as critical. So you keep expanding. And this is why this is complex. And what I'm doing with my client is actually make a decision. What is the cost and benefit of complying to these regulations? If the cost is actually higher than the benefits, well, we need to do something about it. But at some point, if the penalties are higher, so compared to the implementation cost, we have to do it. But at some point, it might be the opposite, and we may just decide not to take anything in terms of actions, take the risk, and pay the penalty in case it goes wrong. But this has to be carefully assessed. Don't do it alone. Bring management on board so they know exactly what's happening, and then we're just signing up. And yes, maybe we have a gap for some of the regulation. We know about it, but if something happens, no one from you will take the blame. That's a company decision.
Barry, anything you would like to add on this?
Yeah, I think Antoine said it very well. And, if we look at the difference between the SEC and this, we see the European Union is worried about critical infrastructure, and the SEC is worried about investor protection. So there might be that different viewpoint, and one way you have to publicly communicate, and one way you can communicate in a different way. So I don't see any direct conflicts, but it's just timelines, differences in where you have to go, and you might need to focus on your risk management more and more to identify the risks that really matter. And that goes to Antoine's last point as well, making sure you focus on the right risks.
There is also an element in between. When you have conflicts, just speak to the authorities at some point. So back to what I was saying, well, yes, please comply. If there's a regulation, there's good reason, so they will force you to do so. But at some point, there's always a dialogue with the authorities. Now I'm dealing with China because for some of my clients, they do have Chinese data out of China, and we need to really negotiate what is critical, what is less critical. And at some point, we have different scenarios, 1, 2, 3, and then we can agree on this together with the governments in China. Believe it or not, but we can negotiate some elements with them. And at some points, this is a good way to reduce the compliance cost for us while still making some of the key third parties happy. So the dialogue is key.
Thank you very much. Very informative. We have another questions, and I think this is more towards the communication on the people in charge and latest consequence, the board, the advisory board, the C-level. Are quantitative risk measurements effective as a tool to communicate SAP risks for C-level or even the board? What is your experience on this?
Well, I think the board seeing information about SAP systems is probably fairly new, and it would need to be tied to a risk. So you would be looking at risk-related quantitative and qualitative reporting, and the broader cybersecurity topic as well. I think that's fairly new. So in terms of experience of what is at the appropriate level, it's actually to manage the material risks. And there the company needs to define what is material to the company and use those thresholds to see what the board needs to know about. The most important thing is to communicate. And we can see with SolarWinds, it didn't communicate well. They didn't communicate well. They weren't always accurate, and they weren't always truthful. And that's the SEC's main charges at the moment. And the whole idea is to be honest and to be, communicate as quickly as possible, because the US regulator is not going to forgive that easily. But now we're getting into the metrics that need to be monitored, and that's still a process that needs to be tailored specifically for your organization based upon your risks and your risk appetite and your risk thresholds. Yeah.
Anything you would like to add, Antoine?
No, all good.
No. Perfect, perfectly said. I would like to add something on this also, and as a question to you guys. With those new regulation, there comes also a new part of liability. Let's call it C-level liability, that they need to fulfill a few things that really have an impact also on SAP, on the transparency, on risk assessments. And if they ignore that, they will be partially personal liable. Do you have any experience already? Is that part of the discussions that you have with your customers? Because now not only the people who are directly involved into the topic of SAP security and compliance will take care of this, also the senior management will raise those questions and ask, where are we vulnerable into the organization, right?
This was quite interesting because we had this discussion in the Digital Director Network, because CISOs aren't always covered by the standard director and officer insurance policies. So most listed companies in the US, and it's probably true of many other jurisdictions as well, actually have insurance policies to cover some of this. And it's typical that an officer of the company, an official, normally at director level, is actually covered by the insurance that the company pays the premium for. And what we did see, and this was reported, that some of the CISOs are not seen as senior executives. And you can probably say the same about the SAP security people. They might not be seen, and then they would specifically need to be named as covered people in the insurance policies. But the legal expenses would then be covered if that is insured. And it might be worthwhile. I know that Zurich Insurance did say that eventually cyber risk would become uninsurable because if it happens too often and has too much impact. But at the moment, it is possible to get insurance for that.
What I also learned is that it is a EU directive with NIS2, and that some countries are discussing to enroll it and also make those D&O insurances explicitly not actively happening or helping for severe cybersecurity incidents that happen. There is some dynamic also in that area, where usually compared to GDPR, C-level was covered by D&O insurances, so they were more or less spending someone else's money. When this changes and there is really a real personal liability, and you have an impact in SAP environments, which can easily cost you hundreds of thousands, maybe millions a day when they are not available, this could be really painful for some people who are in charge in latest consequences, correct?
I think when we saw the picture of Tim, I don't think he's going to have a happy Christmas. I mean, he's got some serious liabilities to cover there. And I think this is going to become more and more of a problem. Normally, it's all about gross negligence. And you know, if you're negligent, if you hide the truth, if you don't communicate properly, then you might have greater liability. But yeah, I think some of the insurers are starting to cut back on what can be covered, as you were saying. Not an expert in the field, but I think there is actually a webcast coming up from the Digital Director Network specifically on cyber insurance.
Okay. That will be interesting. We might also have a look at that when we have our on-site event next year. Again, want to mention it, Lausanne and Zurich. Information will follow. For now, I think we can close the round. We have a little bit of a delay, but there was also some weather turbulence. But I want to thank you very much, Antoine and Barry, for this very interesting session. Thanks for also helping out during my absence at that point. I hope the people enjoyed the session as much as I did. In case there are any further questions coming up, please feel free to reach out to us. And yes, we are happy to continue the conversations with you and look forward to a secure and compliant SAP year in 2024. Anything else you would like to add, Antoine, Barry? How was it for you?
That was good. So feel free.
No, that was exciting. I was happy to be there. Looking forward to it. And as I said, keep talking. There's so many things happening in this world. So the community is the best way to protect ourselves, learn from the others before we learn on our own situations.
Exactly.
Yeah, we don't want to see any of your faces up on the next presentation. So
no, definitely not. All right. Then thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Have a wonderful day and see you very, very, very soon.